So, thanks for coming along as always, folks. It's lovely to be able to share these deeper parts of our practice with you. The asana is really just the tip of the iceberg in the yoga practice. It's the first thing we see, but ultimately the least important part of the practice. A little reminder, it's a discussion or a little informal series of reminders of what our practice is about and its purpose and different methods we can use to achieve that purpose, we could say. As always, I welcome your questions, your comments, your input, so don't be afraid to speak if you would like to do so. I have, for the first time, ever got not a pre-recorded question, but a pre-requested question from someone who couldn't be here tonight. But I thought before we go to that, does anyone else have any questions they'd like to begin with? Rightio, away we go then. So this is from Emily. Hi Emily. I know you'll be watching this at some point. So I printed her question because it's reasonably involved, but I thought it's quite an interesting one to start with. So she says, in the traditional kosher system, or 5 bodies, 5 layers of being, of the yoga system, we have Annamaya kosha, the physical or material body, the Pranamaya kosha, the prana, life force, energy and emotional body, the Manomaya kosha, which is mind and intellect, the Vijnanamaya kosha, which is intuitive, and the Anandamaya kosha, the bliss sheath, ether or space element. So before I go on to the second part, who's not familiar with the idea of koshas or sheaths or envelopes in the practice? So it's a really interesting one because it actually only comes up in one really old text from about, give or take, 600 BCE. Now it's called Taittiriya Upanishad, I think, from memory. And it talks about how there are 5 layers to our material existence. So the outermost, the most gross, not in gross word, but gross, obvious, is called the Annamaya kosha, and we usually call that the physical body, but it literally means the body of food. Actually, it means the illusory body of food would be probably a more literal translation. Then we have the Pranamaya kosha, which we could translate as the illusory body of energy, or prana, or life force. And these are like, I guess, the layers of an onion. So we start at the outer, and then they're sort of expressed sort of as concentric circles, we could say, or concentric spheres. And then we have the Manomaya kosha, which is usually translated as the layer of the mind. And beneath that we have the Vijnanamaya kosha, which is usually considered to be intellect, or let's say intuition or higher intellect. I'll come back to those a little bit in a moment to split those two up. And then we have the final layer is the Anandamaya kosha, the layer of bliss. And each layer is sort of connected to and directly affected by the ones that it's adjacent to, and is, we could say, filled by the increasingly subtle layers. So the outer layer, the Annamaya kosha, is filled by all 4 of the more subtle layers. Then the Pranamaya kosha is filled by all 3 of the Manomaya kosha, Vijnanamaya kosha, and Anandamaya kosha. The Manomaya kosha is filled by the 2 layers of Vijnanamaya and Anandamaya, and so on. You get the idea. So each one is filled by the layers, you could say, inside it. Just going back to Manomaya kosha and Vijnanamaya kosha. Manas, the word that Manomaya kosha comes from, means really the ability to think or process information. So when we speak of the layer of the mind or the manas, it's the ability to, let's say, understand concepts, or to to process information might be another way to think of it. Whereas the Vijnanamaya kosha is sometimes called the layer of intuition. It's also sometimes called the layer of the buddhi, which is the higher mind, which is sort of our, sort of described as our discriminating intellect. So that which knows what to do with the information that's processed in the mind, if that makes sense. So there is a subtle difference between those two layers of the ability to think and knowing what to do with the outcome of thinking. Sometimes the Vijnanamaya kosha is considered the layer of wisdom, would be another way to think of it. Does that sort of make sense? I don't want to go into it too much because, as I say, although this has become really pervasive in modern yoga, it only shows up in one fairly obscure text from, like I say, over 2,500 years ago. But for some reason, it's become one of the ideas that's been held onto in the modern yoga world, like lots of other seemingly arbitrary ideas that have been held onto, like the idea of 7 chakras, which is, again, just another one of those kind of weird things that doesn't really show up in most texts and is actually contradicted in many texts. But for some reason, this idea of the 5 koshas has become part of our mainstream modern yoga understanding. Anyway, that all makes sense to, at least on a superficial level? Okay, so here's the question. Do you think that we as modern people now have a digital Maya kosha, whether we like it or not? I.e., is it, our digital identities now follow us around and wrap around our bodies something like a sheath. Our digital kosha is now a very real layer of identity before adding the hyperfrills and cufflinks of a shiny, well-preened social media identity. We still have digital bank numbers, tax file numbers, passport numbers, phone numbers, email accounts, more passwords than we can remember in a lifetime, all floating around us like a cloud of data. I particularly love your strong anti-social media stance, and yet wonder how deep are we already in, over our heads perhaps? Can you share your thoughts on the Data Maya kosha? Interesting question, eh? Which is why I thought it would be a good one to start with. Would anyone like to take a little stab at what my thoughts might be, or present their own thoughts?
I think it would be only if you place any importance on that identity that it becomes like being quite real. I don't know, like purpose, validity, importance, whatever you want to call it. Like, it's maybe the most illusory of all.
In some respects. Anyone else? There's not going to be a right or wrong here, but we can all present our ideas around it.
Yeah, I feel like it would depend on the person, I guess. But yeah, I don't know to what extent. If someone is really over their heads in it.
So I think when I first read this question, I was sort of thinking, my immediate reaction was, oh yeah, wow, it is another kosha. But then I sat for a few moments and it occurred to me that the idea of the koshas is that these are layers that are fundamental to our existence as human beings. So they're inescapable, completely inescapable. And so without any one of those elements, we cease to exist as a human being. If the body dies, is destroyed, the human being is dead. If there's no life force in the body, we stop breathing, the body dies. If there's no mind, we could say we're functionally not a human being, even if we're kept, with the physical body alive on life support. You could say that ability to think or process information is a fundamental part of at least being an interactive human being, I guess. And so I don't believe that we have a Data Maya kosha. I don't believe that it's another inherent layer to our existence. But along with what you guys were saying, I think that it is a layer of false identity that we can hold on to. And so in that sense, it's really another layer of the ahamkara. So again, the term ahamkara means the construct of the body and mind as an individual, or our sense of personalised identity. And in that sense, I would say it's like a subset of perhaps the Manomaya kosha, where we have this tendency to associate with our thoughts and ideas and define ourselves by our thoughts and ideas. And so, just like Phil was saying, in particular, I think if we don't, whilst having passwords and, bank accounts and things like that are a part of our modern lifestyle, I don't think we have to identify with them. But I think there is a great tendency for many people to do so. And I think particularly in the social media context, we can see a lot of people who have created, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes very consciously, a separate persona on social media that is the identity perhaps they'd like to have. And how often perhaps that happens because real life is a bit boring, or not as happy as they'd like, or they're not feeling as fulfilled as they'd like. And so there's a tendency through social media in particular to create a false persona of identity, and to try and to latch onto that and attribute some importance to that. And so in that sense, like all of our other identities, whether it be as a work colleague, whether it be as a family member, whether it be as a friend, whether it be as something we do as part of charity work, or sporting activities we do, we have the ability to define ourselves, or let's say the tendency to define ourselves by all these little identities. Whether it's I'm the person who does this or does that or doesn't do that, I'm good at my job, I'm bad at my job, I'm a happy person, I'm a sad person, I like socialising, I don't like socialising. These are all different ways that we can get caught into a sense of contracted identity or individualised identity. So in that sense, I think particularly social media has the capacity, which we've seen grow rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years, of becoming something that people get really attached to. And in that sense, like all of our other identities, the more we hold on to it, the more it limits us, the more it makes us believe that we're something and not something else. And this is the nature of duality that we all not necessarily are born into, but grow into, where we think of ourselves as an individual, separate from everything else. And this really comes back to the heart of what a yoga practice actually is about. It's about, you've heard me say this before, it's a series of tools that we have to answer the question of who am I on a fundamental level. Is there a real me, and if so, what is that real me? And from a non-dual perspective, the teachings or the reminders are very clear that our fundamental nature is without definition, is actually limitless, and all the identifications with the koshas, so with the I am this body, or I am this mind, or I am this emotion, or this emotion, or this series of emotions, they're all limited false identities that keep us in a contracted sense of who and what our real nature is, or what our fundamental nature is. And so you've heard me say it many times before, that we will often say that, my body is feeling this, or my mind, is busy, or my mind, is not my friend at the moment, or all these other my and yet we don't give due thought or due credit to understanding who the me is that has the body or has the mind. And that's really what our practice is about. It's about, once we understand that I have a body, but I'm not the body, or I have a mind, but I'm not the mind, then what am I? Who am I? And if we're very honest with ourselves and determined to find the answer to that question, it becomes a lifelong challenge to unravel all those false identities. So we need to let go of the identity of being the body. I am, such and such, this height, this colour hair, these eyes. We need to let go of the identity with the mind in all its forms, and I'm going to include in that our data maya kosha, our digital identity, who we present ourselves as in the digital sphere, because most of us recognise that that's usually very, very much not what's happening in our physical manifest existence. We also need to recognise ultimately that we can observe emotions and intuition, and in the process of observing my emotions, we're stating implicitly that we are not the emotions either. So we, with this understanding of what the 5 koshas are, our practice isn't of trying to analyse them or figure out all the different ways they manifest. It's actually about recognising that however they manifest, we're not there. Does that make sense? Because the illusion of growing up, let's say, tells us I am the body, the mind, the emotions. And our yoga practice is reminding us that if we pay attention, we recognise that we are not those things at all. There's a very clear subject-object relationship where we as the subject observe the object of the body, as the subject we observe the object of the mind, we observe the object of the emotions. And as soon as we create that subject-object relationship, then we recognise that we are not, as the subject, the object that we observe. And the reason I want that to be really clear is that when I got this question a couple of days ago, I just sort of thought I'd do a bit of digging around to see any other thoughts people have had recently about the koshas and how we're identified with them and how our practice should approach them. And one of the interesting things I found interesting and quite sad was an article in a popular yoga magazine about talking about the koshas, and it talked about them sort of like I did at the outset, describe the 5 names and what they sort of mean in a rough sense. And then it talked about how in a non-dual sense, in a direct path or direct practice sense, the purpose of yoga is very clear, that it's to recognise that any identification with the koshas is a false identity and we need to break free of it. And then it said, but in modern day life, we don't really want to do that. So let's figure out how we can embrace our koshas and learn to use them to our advantage. And that is nonsense, because that's not yoga. It said as modern yoga practitioners, we don't want to have that, that high goal, let's say, of recognising the false identities and in so doing finding our true identity, our true nature. That's the meaning of the word yoga, is to unite, to become one. So if the goal of our practice isn't to become one with universal consciousness, with God, with whatever you want to call it, then we're not yoga practitioners at all. We're just feeding this false identity with the body and the mind.
Don't you think that's just dumbing down, like it's the dumbing down of it?
Yeah.
Because it is hard. Like the path is hard. Like
Damn
I read
straight.
something similar the other day about tapas, you know, like saying that, you know, it's basically to get rid of the obstacles, like because the goal of yoga is to be liberated and free. And so we go through these processes to kind of like get rid of these obstacles so that we can be free from who we are. And then it said, yeah, but that's really hard. So we can just do that on our yoga mat. We can just like try and do this yoga pose and blah, blah, blah. And I was just reading it going, this is shit. Like,
It's been a bit half-assed with that, really. Well, I mean, just not committing to,
Yeah.
you know.
yeah, because it's hard. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And we want
it's
everyone
like
to
picking
be
and choosing what, kind of picking and choosing what
Yeah.
parts you want
cherry
to
picking.
sort of associate with, and not really, you know, diving right into it. And
Yeah. It's fundamentally changing what our practice is. So, you know, I think you're both right. It's the dumbing down of it. It's being half committed, and it's an attempt to make yoga. Well, it's not even making yoga palatable. It's about making some of the practices of yoga palatable and calling them yoga when they're not. You know, as you've heard me say before, it's like someone learning to sharpen knives and calling themselves a chef even though they've never made food in their life. You know, doing fancy postures isn't a yoga practitioner. A yoga practitioner is someone whose burning desire, whose tapas, whose zeal, whose inner fire, whose primary drive is to remember their true nature.
It's not saying that people who do have advanced practices are not also on that path.
No. They're not mutually exclusive. It's like Venn diagrams. You can have overlap between them. But asana and yoga practitioners are not automatically connected. People who can hold their breath and yoga practitioners are not automatically connected. People who sing mantra or sacred songs are not automatically yoga practitioners. The yoga practitioner, by its very definition, is someone whose primary goal in their life is to remember their true self. And that's difficult, that's challenging, because we've spent our whole lifetime with this idea of being a body or being a mind with our little definition of who and what we are, and then to try and break free of all of those definitions of what you are, to let them go to create, or let's say open to the possibility of being something else, is very challenging. Because our identity is our little comfort zone, our little safe space. You know, as long as we stay within our little comfort zone, you know, eating the foods we like, drinking the drinks we like, doing the things we like, hanging out with the people we like, where we feel safe. It's easy. But that's not what our practice is about. It's not about necessarily finding a space where things are easy or safe. It's actually about challenge. It's about challenging all of our ideas, all of our concepts around what we are, and finding the truth of what we are. And so we talked a little bit about this subject-object relationship of, you know, me as the subject observing the object, whether it's the body, the mind, the camera, the wall, doesn't matter. We have this sense of duality created by the subject-object relationship. And in some of the very old non-dual traditions, they take that process to its final outcome by not just recognising that subject-object relationship in the outer world, but turning that same process within, as we were sort of talking about a moment ago, saying, my body, well, my body, I'm not the body, my mind, I'm not the body, my emotions, I'm not the emotions, and taking that to increasingly subtle layers until there's nothing left that you can observe. And when everything you can observe has been taken away, what remains is yourself. It's like, you know, a process of elimination. So that's one way, really that's a very, very direct way for us to approach our practice. Every time we recognise a subject-object relationship, particularly once we start to turn our senses within and start to pay attention to the inner world, then that becomes one more thing that we are not. So, you know, that process talks about how we don't need anything to tell us what we are. We just need to get rid of everything that we realise that we're not. And then what remains is our essential nature, our fundamental nature. Call it self, call it soul, doesn't matter. They're all just words that have different meaning, and the words themselves create limitations around the understanding of what our true nature actually is. So I think it's really, you know, as we dig deeper into our yoga practice on a deeper level, not just on an external level, it's really important to understand that there are these increasingly subtle layers of false identity, starting with the identity with the body, moving to, as I said, the layer of the energy that moves the body, the layer of the mind, the layer of the emotions, and even the layer of bliss, the Anandamaya kosha, is not, we said very clearly, not to be the nature of the self. It's a very thin veil between, you know, who we truly are and what we think we are. But it also needs to be transcended, to recognise that there is a subject-object relationship in the Anandamaya kosha, the layer of bliss, or false identity with bliss as well. Because bliss itself implies the possibility of the lack of bliss. Or let's say, you know, happiness implies a lack of happiness, or contentment implies a lack of contentment. And the nature of the self is indescribable emptiness, but at the same time indescribable fullness. Empty in that it has no qualities of its own. There's nothing you can say it is, but everything that exists within you, within consciousness, which is your fundamental nature. And so everything that exists is within consciousness, and therefore it's completely full. So there's that paradox, depending on how we want to see non-duality, the oneness of, is it completely full or is it completely empty? But it has no variation. Oneness or uniformity, by definition, cannot have variance. Does that make sense? There can be no subject-object relationship. There can be no limitation on it, of what it is or what it's not, because if there's limitation to what it is or what it's not, then it's no longer oneness. It's no longer the supreme, the all-pervading, ever-present. And to drill down to that level of self-inquiry and to break out of all of those false identities takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of diligence and perseverance. And that's why, you know, there is that tendency to dumb down the practice, to make it more palatable, to give people, you know, a watered down variation of what yoga is. And in so doing, by giving people a dumbed down variation, by, you know, telling them they don't have to worry about, you know, the deeper practices, it's robbing them of the potential for liberation. And so from the perspective of a teacher, I think the most important thing I can remind you all of is that yoga is not about anything other than the rediscovery of your true nature. And everything else is secondary to that. The practices that we share of asana and pranayama and sitting are tools to help you rediscover that within yourself. But they're not important in and of themselves if they're not used for that purpose. And there is no other purpose to our practice. There are different tools we can use, but the sole purpose of yoga, by very definition, as I mentioned, is to come back to oneness, to the indivisible, to the ever-present, to the omnipotent, omniscient. You know, using those Greek terms because they pop up in our world a little bit more perhaps than the Sanskrit ones do.
Don't you think though too that, I mean, because you know, our teacher uses very, like it's very simple, like you know, calls it his cocktail. It's a very simple kind of simple practices, but they just take diligence and time and everything. And I like sometimes I think that people, they run away from it because they want to think about it more. They want to intellectualize it more. Like it can't be that simple that I just have to witness my mind. Like it has to be more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And so people get scared because it shouldn't be that simple. It's not easy.
I don't think it's that they get scared. I think they get bored.
Yeah, watching your mind is so boring.
It actually, well, I mean, it's both really interesting and really boring at the same time, because you realise that there's all sorts of random crap going on. You couldn't write that in a movie. Like it's so wacky and crazy, the ideas that pop up about, you know, the ahamkara comes up with to try and reassert our association with the mind. You couldn't make that shit up. At the same time, it's really boring to go through the same set of tools, to pick up the same tools again and again and again and again and again. And the ahamkara thrives on diversity, on change. And so that's where when you give people those really limited set of practices, initially the mind goes, oh, something new. You know, I've never been told to sit and watch my breath before I'll do that. That's new and exciting. But after a while, it's not new and exciting anymore. And that's when the challenge starts, and that's actually when our practice begins. Whilst we're just feeding the desire of the ahamkara, of the ego, for something different, we're not actually practicing yoga at all. We're just feeding the ahamkara. So the first time, you know, we come to an asana practice and we're asked to make new shapes with our body that we haven't made before, perhaps. You know, it's new and exciting. The challenge of the asana practice is to keep making those same shapes again and again and again and again and again, and recognise what changes and recognise what doesn't. And, you know, just on that note, remember one of the other things that we've talked about in the past, not for a while perhaps, is if we're searching for the indivisible, for the sameness, for the oneness of our true nature, it's that which does not change. So anything that changes is simply to be recognised as transient phenomena, unimportant transient phenomena. Recognising that the body changes over time. The 15th time we do, you know, Pajvakonasana, it feels different to the first time. Well, the body's changed. It's a transient phenomenon, not worth paying too much attention to. The thoughts in the mind are constantly changing. So the mind is a transient phenomenon that isn't worth paying too much attention to. It's really difficult for us to be given a really, really simple set of tools and keep applying them again and again and again and again. And again, that's where the modern yoga world has failed its students in many respects, because it keeps telling people, do a fancier posture, do a more complex sequence, you know, take a different style of yoga.
Put a goat on your back.
Put a goat on your back.
Goat yoga. Like goat yoga. Seriously.
I had someone actually say to me the other day, if you had goat yoga and wine yoga combined, I'd be there. The practice isn't about adding more diversity, it's about trying to find the sameness. And so a simple set of tools, a simple set of practices is actually all we need. And it's interesting what you were saying about, people thinking it can't be that easy. I got an email from an old student a couple of weeks ago asking a couple of questions, and I sent him a fairly lengthy email back answering his question from a couple of different perspectives. And I didn't hear back from him until this afternoon, and he sent me back another email saying, thanks for your reply, such blah 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 blah. Since speaking to you, I did a study in Buddhism and psychology, and then I've also discovered this person, and then I've also discovered this person. I've just listened to 176 podcasts, and what struck me is that this person one of the things I said to them initially is, you actually already know everything you need to know. You have all the practices you need. You just need to stop thinking. And then I get the email back saying, I've added more practices and more different perspectives, and it finished with, now I've got all these new ideas and concepts to think about. And maybe you'll watch this at some point, you know who you are. Stop fucking thinking. Just sit. Because actually that's the simplicity of our practice. The more, I talked about the false identity with the koshas, or with our identity. And this conversation came up with a student earlier today as well, particularly when we have a tendency to be very cerebral, when we have a job or a lifestyle that has us in our head a lot, intellectualizing things, that becomes a fundamental part of who we think we are, of our identity. And I believe that high-functioning intellect is one of the greatest impediments to realisation of the self that there is. Because the mind is so subtle and so seemingly beneficial to have an intellect and to be able to think, that we tell ourselves, or we're told by the ahamkara, it can't possibly be a bad thing to think this problem through, right? I'll think my way out of the mind. I mean, that's so nonsensical when you say it that way, but that's the trap that is so easy to fall into. It's actually much, much easier in many ways to let go of the identification with the Manamaya kosha when you don't have a high-functioning intellect and it hasn't been a big part of your definition of yourself. Does that make sense?
I should be right then.
I know, right? So I've talked to you, I've mentioned it once or twice before. We talk sometimes about how another word for the self or consciousness is simply pure presence, being utterly in the moment from moment to moment. And there's this old paradox in psychology, I can't remember if it's Jungian or Freudian, about the man walking past a cow in a field going, oh, poor cow, all you do is eat grass and walk around all day. And then the next thought he goes, lucky cow, all you do is eat grass and walk around all day. Because the cow is fundamentally in the present. It's not thinking about what it's going to do next week. Just, I'm going to walk around and eat some grass, and then I'm going to walk around some more and eat some more grass. And that's all it's doing. It's simply in the present. That paradox of our high-functioning intellect, the ability to remember the past and then project that into the future, is actually what stops us from being present, which prevents us from resting in the simplicity and unity of now. Past and future are duality and flip sides of the same coin. The present is simply one. And that is, again, another way to think about practice. It's about being in each moment, from moment to moment, and not holding on to the moment that's just gone, and not looking forward with expectation to the moment that will soon arise. I've mentioned before about this Tibetan Rinpoche, who talks about being beyond fear and hope, beyond the fear of the moment getting any worse, and beyond the hope of it being any better. The moment is simply here and now, without those dualities of fear and hope, like and don't like, past and future. But we can never truly find that sense of pure presence, of pure consciousness, of self, of Brahman, of Buddha mind, whilst ever we hold on to our false identities, whatever they may be. Whether it's I am this body with these attributes, whether it's I am this mind with these attributes, whether I am this social media personality, whether it's I am this emotional personality. Those things are all false identities. They're not something we need to destroy, but they're something we need to recognise as not being our fundamental nature. You know, the analogy that comes up a lot in a lot of the old yoga texts is, you know, our clothing is not who we are, it's something we wear. And we don't put on this shirt and go, oh well, I'm a blue long sleeve cotton shirt. We recognise that it's something we wear, but it's not something that we are. And in the same way, the koshas are things that we wear that encapsulate our true nature, but they're not what we are. But when I was like 10 years old, we moved from Sydney to this little, to Foster, this little sort of coastal tourist and fishing village, and I went to went to the local primary school, and I only had one winter jacket. It was this lime green parka, and I mean bright lime green. And for the first, we moved there just before winter, and so for like 4 months I turned up to school every single day in this lime green, you know, puffy parka, and so I just got called the Green Frog. By my principal. Because I'd been wearing that same clothing for such a long time that it became my identity. In the same way, we've been wearing the body and the mind for so long that we've started to identify with it. In fact, we haven't just started to, we're fully in it. And so our practice is about recognising that that is not our fundamental nature. We can take off the parka and put on a different shirt. We don't have to be limited by what the body or mind have done in the past. We don't even need to think about the future because it's completely unknown and out of our hands. All we need to do is break down all of these false identities to rest in the present, to find the changeless, that part of us which is ever present. When we go about our yoga practice in all its forms, when we go about our day-to-day activities, what is it about me that hasn't changed? What is it about which I can find no subject-object relationship that I know exists but is indescribable? And that requires dedication and a razor-sharp inner focus. As you've heard me say before, you know, when we've first come to the yoga practice and the teacher says, reach your arm out at shoulder height and stretch to your fingers, and we go, yeah. Because our attention is so unfocused that we don't even know what our arm's doing. How much more difficult is it then to know what our mind's doing, what our breath's doing? To know what emotions are arising in the heart. These are increasing levels of subtlety that require ever sharper focus. And that's where the practice is difficult. And that's where people get bored or get disheartened. Because
also, Steve, just on that, you know, you're talking about the practice made too simple for people. They think it is, and they want the more advanced asanas or the pranayama sequences. I think also, once you've been doing the practice for a while and you start to chip away, you actually don't like what you see. So you want the more difficult asana, or the more difficult pranayama, because you actually think, oh, you want to just don't know if I like this.
yeah, because when you're absolutely right. Because what happens is as we start to look deeper within, the ahamkara starts to bring up all of the negative thoughts and negative tendencies that we've been suppressing throughout our life or veiling through other behaviours. So it might be things that we've buried so deep we don't even know they're there, or it might be things that we recognise are there, but we've managed to pile so much stuff on top of them that they generally don't surface. And once we start to take away the coverings, that stuff that's underneath starts to come up again. And you're right, it's often unpleasant stuff. It's where we start to realise how
Full of shit you are.
yeah,
But then that's part of it
But
as well.
that is
that's
part
part
of
of the story, to kind of like to think like negatively about yourself too. Do you know what I mean? Like then all the shame and everything comes, and
Yeah.
that's all part of it.
and those things also need to be, you're absolutely right, and those things also need to be let go of. So we can't, it doesn't serve us to identify with I'm a good person or I'm a smart person or I'm a healthy person. And it also doesn't serve us to identify with being a stupid person, an uncaring person or an unhealthy person. The only thing that helps us is to understand that we're not a person at all. And whatever personal identity you hold on to is stopping you from recognising yourself. Because these are limitations. They're false identities that we've built up by wearing the same green parka for so long that everyone thinks that's what we are. And so it is challenging when we start to recognise, well, let's say when the ahamkara starts to become revealed, that when there starts to be little glimpses into the illusory nature of the self or of the limited self, whether it's the body or the mind or the emotions. It's very challenging to let go of that identity. And as you've heard me say before, the ahamkara doesn't like its illusory nature to be revealed. So it starts to look for other ways to tie us in with it. So in those times when, as you say, you start to recognise unpleasant personality traits, let's say, it will start to go, you thought you were a good person, but look, you're really a horrible person. Because that becomes another way for you to identify with being a person, being a body or a mind. And the ahamkara, the nature of the body-mind construct, that sense of individuality, is that, at least on some level, for a period of time, it is absolutely 100% focused on perpetuating your identity with it. Initially, it does not wish its illusory nature to be revealed. And so it will find all sorts of different ways, all sorts of old ideas, old thoughts, old emotions to bring up to the surface to make you identify with being a person again. But I tell you, in absolute truth, you are not a person. You might be wearing a person's body and mind. You might be experiencing the world through that mechanism, but it is not your fundamental nature. It exists within your fundamental nature, within consciousness. And yet, paradoxically, consciousness moves outwards through it. I talked about the empty or the full, both are different ways of expressing non-duality. It's a paradox. And in the same way, both the body and mind appear within consciousness, and yet consciousness moves out through the body and mind. These are just looking at the two sides of the same coin from different perspectives. It's actually just a closed loop that keeps cycling back on itself. Outside, inside, inside, outside. There's no difference. But that probably doesn't make sense to most of you at this point. And that's okay. But it is important that we start to break down all of these false identifications via whatever tools work for you. So it might be, for a lot of us initially, you know, the asana practice is a great way to bring the mind to a sense of presence, to let go of some of the busyness. And I've mentioned this, I think I mentioned it last time we sat, that if we think of ourselves, let's say, it's an analogy and it's not perfect, but perhaps it gives you some idea. Let's say our little constrained, contracted self is here, and the barrier that prevents us from realising our expansive, all-inclusive true nature is the ahamkara, the mind. And the faster that moves, let's say it's like a single object, and we're in the centre, and this single object of the ahamkara is circling around us. And whilst that object of the ahamkara, or that manifestation of the ahamkara, is going really, 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 really fast, it seems to be a continuous barrier. It seems to be something that is an impenetrable barrier. And so whilst the mind is really, really fast, spinning rapidly, constant thoughts of past and future and this and that and good and bad and like and don't like and I'm this and I'm not that, we can't get through that barrier. But once we start to slow the mind down, we start to see that really it's just this tiny little object and there's nothing but space. Does that make sense? By slowing the mind down, we remove the barrier to opening out into our expansive nature. Because the slower it moves, the slower the mind moves, the quieter the inner dialogue becomes, the more we recognise that the mind is there sometimes and not there other times. And yet I'm ever present. So if I'm ever present and the mind comes and goes, how can I be the mind? But whilst the mind is ever present, because we're feeding it, because we're allowing it to move at 1,000,000 miles an hour, we don't recognise the gaps. We don't recognise the times when the mind doesn't exist. So that's why, initially the asana practice is very beneficial, because it is for most people, a very powerful way of slowing the mind down, bringing us to a sense of presence. Because it takes a lot of focus to go from this, I'm straightening my arm and reaching to my fingers, to this, I'm straightening my arm and reaching out to my fingers. In the same way as we fine-tune our focus and our alertness, it takes us time to be able to slow our breath down, make it calmer and smoother, not just when we're in our asana practice, but in everything that we do. As we fine-tune our alertness, we start to be able to more easily tune out irrelevant thoughts, recognising when the mind is simply engaging in the actions of the present, as my teacher wrote in one of his poems, just remembering which way to put the pants on, or when it's simply wandering off with memories of the past and imaginings of the future. Hold on to the thoughts that are relevant in the present and ignore everything else. And then the mind becomes very quiet. Instead of the constant whirling cyclone of seemingly impenetrable barrier, we start to realise it's just this thing that pops up every now and then when we need it, and then it just fades away again. And the more we learn to be attentive to that, the more we can have it there, but not identified with it. Just as we can have the body here, but know that we're not the body. So we're not killing the body, we're not killing the mind. We're simply breaking our identification of me with it. through cultivating inner focus, by breaking down false identity, whether that's through recognising that subject-object relationship, whether it's through bringing the mind to presence. Doesn't matter how we do it. But we have to, if we wish to be free, truly free, we need to break down all of those false identities. And as my teacher has said many times, and you've heard me say as well, the moksha, the liberation, the nirvana that's talked about in Eastern traditions is not freedom of the person, it's freedom from the person. Recognising that the person may exist on some level, but you are not it and you never were it. You are something indescribably vast and yet infinitely subtle. And whilst ever you hold on to I am the person on whatever level, there will never be freedom. And once you let go completely of that identity with the person, there is instantaneously freedom.
So there's kind of like letting go of that identity, but it's actually still part of our existence.
It's not part of our existence, it's part of the manifestation of existence, you could say. Because as soon as we, and again this is where we need to be just mindful of language and its power.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we start to say me, my, I, we start to personalise and identify with. And so it's not to say that, you know, after full awakening, Kate no longer, you know, does the things that Kate does. Kate will still do all that stuff. The ahamkara of Kate will still operate in day-to-day life. And you'll be observing Kate whilst Kate goes about doing all of her stuff. So it's stepping back. And actually, Nadine showed me something the other day, a couple of weeks ago now, about that Jim Carrey said recently. And he said, I used to think I was a person experiencing the world. Now I'm experiencing the world and the universe. Now I realise I'm the universe experiencing Jim Carrey. And that's an expression of an understanding of your true nature. That you are no longer the person. You might be aware of everything the person's aware of, but that's because, as I said, your consciousness moves out through the senses of the person to experience the manifest world. And so in that sense, you are still aware of what Kate experiences. But paradoxically, everything that Kate experiences exists in the emptiness, which is consciousness. And again, I know that perhaps doesn't make sense to some of you, and it doesn't need to. But these are the two sides of duality. Consciousness moves out through the ahamkara, through the five senses, to experience the world. And yet, as consciousness, you are experiencing the person experiencing the world. Or as universal consciousness, you are experiencing the person experiencing the universe. And perhaps that makes sense on an intellectual level, but an intellectual level isn't enough, because understanding it with your head is not the same as knowing it through direct experience or direct recognition. It's not experience, it's recognition. And it's remembering, because we were all born into non-duality. We took our first breaths and the first years of our life experiencing the body, experiencing the world. But the older we got, the longer we'd been wearing the green parka, the more we started to think we were the green parka as opposed to that which was inside. And it's only through repetition, through wearing the same jacket, the same, skin suit for so long, through simple repetition that we've come to associate with it. And if we look with attentiveness, we recognise very clearly that there is a subject-object relationship between you as you and your body and your mind and your emotions. And one of two things happens at that point. You either go, I've got a glimpse of my true self and I can never put this practice down until I find it. Or you go, I'm too scared to let go of my identity, and you walk away. I've used that analogy in the past a few times. It's like the Matrix. Do you want to take the blue pill and go back into the Matrix and never remember that it's that it was an illusion, or do you want to take the red one and stay permanently out of it, knowing that life will be at least initially challenging, but it will be very real. No longer living the illusion of what you are. The practice is the path of the warrior, of the Vira, because it's difficult to maintain that dedication to those same simple set of tools again and again and again. To keep digging the well in the same spot, knowing that you can't just up stumps, move your shovel another 100 metres over and start digging another well, because that's not going to help. You just have to persevere. You've chosen your spot, you've chosen your practice, and you just have to keep digging in the same spot again and again and again and again. And some days you don't want to pick up the shovel, but that's when you pick up the shovel and you dig the well. Because that's ultimately the only way to strike water, right? Keep making the well deeper. We don't know how deep we have to go. We just know that we keep digging until we find water. And we don't, in the same way, we don't know how long we have to keep practicing. We just keep digging and digging and digging until one day, spontaneously, seemingly out of nowhere, the false identities drop away and the knowing of the self starts to arise.
What about those who have attained liberation but they've never practiced, like Eckhart Tolle? Like one day, like just one day. Like, it's just through divine grace? I think it was a struggle after he became liberated, because then he had to deal with what was going on. But yeah, there's a small percentage who do
through other without having an intentional practice, let's say. Yeah, that's certainly the case. And it can happen in lots of different ways. I guess some things that are worth considering are that, as I said, all of us share the same fundamental nature of consciousness. And as I've said to you, our practice is about rediscovering or remembering our true nature. It's not about finding something we didn't already have. It's about remembering what was always there, or rediscovering what was always there. So in that sense, there is no one who does not have the potential to rediscover their true nature, because it is inherent in every single one of us. The practices of self-inquiry or of any spiritual practice are ways to, let's say, prepare us on some level for that remembering, for that rediscovery, so that it isn't shocking. And we've talked, we could say someone like Eckhart Tolle, who apparently had it pop up out of nowhere. You could talk about, there's plenty of people who have had, we could say, awakenings into consciousness through drugs, through traumatic experiences. There's lots of ways perhaps that recognition can be triggered, because it is, as I say, in all of us. But usually if there's an unprepared awakening, it creates great trauma afterwards, because suddenly the entire identity is shattered in a moment. Whereas our practice, if we come to our practice, let's say with an understanding of what it is and what the purpose of our practice is, we don't shatter the ego, that false identity, all in one go. We allow it to break down little by little. So that transition is not so distressing. It's a bit like, we've had, what was it, on Tuesday we had nearly 40 degrees, and then Wednesday we had 20 degrees, and suddenly it was really, really, really cold, wasn't it? Because there was a very, very rapid transition from one to another, and so there was no time to prepare for it, to adjust to it. And in the same way, if there's an unprepared rapid transition from thinking you're the body and the mind to suddenly remembering that you're not that at all, and there's no preparation, it's very, very challenging because there's been no adjustment period, no time to prepare. Whereas when our practice is undertaken over time with an understanding of what may arise as we dig deeper into our practice, when those little steps of breaking down the ahamkara happen, they're still shocking, but they're not so shocking we can't deal with them and still go about our day-to-day life on some level. Does that make sense? So, whether you could say divine grace, pure chance, these are, it's always divine grace and that's all just chance. It's because the chance is divine grace. Again, these are just words. They don't really, they're just different ways to describe the same thing. It's like someone once asked Nisargadatta Maharaj, they were sitting with him, and they said something about, I wanted to bring someone to who's very sick, because people seem to experience miracles when they're in your presence. And he sat there and he said, I don't know that nature allows for the occurrence of miracles unless you accept that everything is a miracle. Divine grace, pure chance. Everything's a miracle, nothing's a miracle. Just depends on how you choose to use language to interpret it. Because language is, as I've said many times, language is an approximation. It's the first layer of falsehood is thought, and then the second one is word. Truth exists in silence only, or in action without thought. But thought and words are approximations at best of truth. And so we don't need to hold on to words, we don't need to hold on to ideas or terms. In fact, we need to let go of them as well. Because they are at best approximations of truth, and they're limited. As all the teachings, all the reminders say, the fundamental nature of the self is without limit, without definition, without constraint. And so once we start to use words like it's this or it's that, we limit it again. Maybe they're close approximations, maybe they're really bad approximations. Maybe for one person a certain word steers them in a certain direction, and maybe for someone else it steers them in completely the opposite direction. We don't need to hold on to words. We simply need to let go of words and ideas and find that which exists in silence. Because the words create duality. The ideas create duality. The self is beyond ideas, beyond words. You can't define it in any way other than that it is. and it is within all of us seeming individuals. Whilst ever we think we are an individual, we need to understand that the self is within you. Pure consciousness, Brahman self, God, it's all, whatever you want to call it, it's within you. And once you recognise, once there's a true understanding and awakening that you're not the person, you recognise that the person is in divine consciousness. But whilst our perspective is one of being an individual, then we need to recognise that the divine is within us, that the self is within. And once we recognise that we're not that, then we recognise all the little individuals are wandering around in the self. Again, moving outwards through the ahamkara, whilst paradoxically being within consciousness. Just ideas. Don't hold on to the ideas, but allow them perhaps to steer you in a certain direction, to motivate you to pay attention. Because that's the only effort we really need, to pay attention. As my teacher says, witnessing, awareness, is happening all the time. It's happening effortlessly. There is no moment when awareness of your thoughts and your feelings and your body is not there. But it's so subtle that we're usually not aware of awareness. Because we're so focused on the gross, the body, the mind, the thoughts, the social media, all those other false identities. And so that's why we have to step back from all of those things that we observe until there is nothing left that we can observe, and what remains is the self, the space of observing. Neither subject nor object, but simply the conjunction of the two. The two sides of the coin come together. The past and future become the present, where good and bad just become what is. That's our practice. That's what yoga is. It's not about being half-assed. Unfortunately, that's the way it's presented to many people in the modern world. It's not about feeding the ego or figuring out how we can use the koshas to our benefit. It's about being free from all of that, which is very simple, but takes time. Simple tools. Don't think too much. Stop thinking. Don't worry about what the body does and doesn't do. It'll change every day. It's just a passing phenomenon. Don't worry about the thoughts or emotions that come up. They're just passing phenomena. They're ephemeral. They don't exist. Just let it all go. And just be what you are, what you've always been. It arises once everything else has been let go of. You take away the veils and the self remains. And that's the sole purpose of our practice, and really the sole purpose of manifest human existence, to rediscover what we've always known and what we've always been, but we've simply forgotten. So that the person can move through life experiencing without being attached to fear or hope, simply experiencing each moment as it comes to pass. Nadia's favourite saying, life experiencing itself, or consciousness experiencing itself, the universe
so
experiencing itself.
life has created a form by which it may experience itself, and that form is you.
So with that all said, does anyone have any last questions before we finish up?
Sometimes like have the thought, and I don't feel like it's worth dwelling on in the practice so much for any length of time, but like, why does this ahamkara exist? Like, why is it there? And I feel like the explanation is really just evolutionary in terms of the species, like being able to identify with the body and interact with the world and other human beings is the function of it.
That's,
and then that's
absolutely it.
And then
Absolutely.
okay.
The ahamkara serves no purpose other than to allow the body to interact with the world around it. It's just, the word you use is function. It's just a function, which is funny because that's the word my teacher uses all the time. The mind is just a function. Just let it do what it does. It's just allowing the body to interact with the world around it. And when it's not necessary, just leave it alone. Just let it do its thing. So yeah, it pops up. Notice the thought, they pop up, and then as long as you don't feed them, they just go away. And yet the ahamkara still continues to function. But without any need to get involved with it. So that is it. So thank you very much, folks, for this evening. It's lovely to be able to share with you all. And remember as you leave this evening that the self is within every single one of us. No one removed from it, no one separate from it. It's just waiting there like a buried treasure that you don't realise you're sitting on. And all you have to do is let go of what you're not to remember what you are. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you very, very much. I hope to see you next time when we gather.